I did not get fired with a screaming match. I got fired with a smile and a calendar invite. "We are just realigning," my new boss said, sliding a folder over like it was a gift. I looked at the signature line and realized they had forgotten one thing. The company's algorithm was never theirs. So I walked out quiet and sold the key that kept their empire breathing to a buyer across the ocean. My name is Camilla Cruz. I am 38 years old, and for the last 14 years, I have been the invisible skeletal system of Vantage Grid Systems. If you walked into our headquarters in Seattle 2 months ago, you would not have seen my name on the glass doors of the executive suites. You would not have seen my face in the shiny quarterly brochures we handed out to investors at the Four Seasons. I was never the person shaking hands or closing deals over 3 martini lunches. I was the person making sure the deals did not explode 6 months later. I built the code that kept this company alive. I designed the client scoring system and the risk warning protocols that flagged dangerous contracts before ink ever touched paper. I was the safety net. But in corporate America, nobody notices the safety net until they are falling. And by then, it is usually too late. Everything changed when Vantage Grid Systems announced the restructuring. That is the polite corporate term for what actually happened, which was a hostile takeover disguised as a merger with Bright Hollow Partners. The old leadership took their golden parachutes and ejected, leaving the rest of us to deal with the new regime. The new king arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning, and his name was Gavin Pierce. Gavin was the kind of CEO who looked like he had been manufactured in a laboratory dedicated to producing mid-Atlantic confidence. He was sleek, tanned, and wore suits that cost more than the average sedan. He spoke exclusively in buzzwords, stringing together sentences about synergy, paradigm shifts, and holistic alignment without ever actually saying anything of substance. He did not care about the product. He did not care about the code. He cared about the stock price and the narrative, and unfortunately for me, I was part of the old narrative. My first interaction with Gavin Pierce was not a handshake. It was an eviction. It was 10 in the morning, and I was deep in the back end of our legacy server, patching a small vulnerability in the reporting module. When Gavin leaned into my doorway, he did not knock. Men like Gavin never knock because they assume every room they enter belongs to them by divine right. "Camilla," he said, reading my name off the doorplate as if tasting a sour grape. "Surely you can have your desk cleared by noon, right?" I stopped typing. I spun my chair around, assuming there was a misunderstanding. "Excuse me." "The desk," Gavin said, gesturing vaguely at my workspace. It was a corner office, modest but hard-earned, with a view of the skyline that I had worked 12 years to get. "We are pivoting the floor plan to encourage open-concept collaboration. My innovation team needs this space for their war room. You know how it is. We need the sunlight to grow ideas." He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. It was a shark's smile, dead and predatory. He looked at me not as a senior engineer with a decade and a half of institutional knowledge, but as a piece of old furniture that clashed with his modern aesthetic. "I have files here dating back to the founding of the platform," I said, my voice steady. "Moving the hard lines alone will take 2 days." "We have IT for that," Gavin said, checking his watch. "Just pack the personal stuff. We are putting you in the annex near the server room. It is quieter there. Better for focus." The annex. The windowless box next to the noisy cooling fans. It was a demotion in everything but the title. "Noon. Camilla," he repeated, tapping the doorframe twice before walking away. "Let us be agile." That was the moment I knew. I did not scream. I did not throw my stapler at his retreating back. I simply looked at the empty doorway and understood my new reality. I was no longer an asset. I was an obstacle. I want you to understand something about my career. I did not climb the corporate ladder. I was the ladder. For 14 years. Project managers and junior executives had climbed up the processes I built to reach the next rung of their careers. They used my data to look smart in board meetings. They used my risk assessments to avoid catastrophes and claim bonuses for prudent management. I never minded being on the ladder. I enjoyed the work. I enjoyed the logic of it. Code does not lie. Code does not play politics. If a variable is wrong, the system breaks. It is honest. But Gavin Pierce did not value honesty. He valued shiny things, and he brought a lot of shiny things with him, along with his tailored suits. Gavin brought his innovation team. They were a squad of 6 or 7 young professionals who looked like they had walked straight out of a catalog for business casual wear. They had glossy resumes filled with startups that had existed for 6 months and accomplished nothing. They used words like disrupt and ideate as if they were religious mantras. They walked through the hallways with the unearned confidence of people who have never had to fix a critical server crash at 3 a.m. on a Sunday. Among them was a specific person Gavin seemed to favor unusually. I noticed it immediately because I am paid to notice patterns. There was a young woman, fresh-faced and eager, who shadowed Gavin everywhere. She did not seem to have a defined role, yet she was in every high-level meeting. He listened to her when she spoke, nodding with an enthusiasm he never showed to the actual department heads. It was the first red flag, a subtle disruption in the data stream of office politics. The second red flag was the silence. After I moved my things to the windowless annex, waiting for the humidity of the server room to ruin my hair, I expected to be called into meetings to explain the transition. I expected questions about the pulse rank algorithm, the core logic engine I had built that practically ran the company's client assessment protocols. Instead, I got silence. I opened my calendar on Monday morning and found it surprisingly empty. The weekly strategy sync, a meeting I had designed the agenda for 5 years ago, was missing. I refreshed the page. Still nothing. I checked the public directory and saw the meeting was still happening in the main conference room, the glass-walled fishbowl I could see from the hallway, but I was no longer on the invite list. Then came the email threads. For years, I had been the first person copied on the daily operational summaries. It was standard procedure. If the risk numbers looked off, I needed to know immediately, but on Wednesday, the summary did not arrive. I asked a sympathetic junior developer to forward it to me. When I opened the forwarded chain, I saw the distribution list. My name had been scrubbed. They were cutting me out of the nervous system of the company I helped build. I sat in my cold, humming box of an office and watched the innovation team parade past my door. They carried laptops covered in stickers and drank cold brew coffee, laughing about how they were going to revolutionize the workflow. They did not know that the workflow was a delicate ecosystem held together by thousands of lines of custom code that I maintained. They did not know that if they pulled the wrong thread, the whole tapestry would unravel. I could have marched into Gavin's office. I could have demanded respect. I could have slammed my hand on the table and listed my contributions, shouted about the nights I slept under my desk to make sure the version rollout didn't crash the client portals. But I did not. Years of analyzing risk had taught me patience. When the numbers turn against you, you do not panic. You gather more data. You look for the anomaly. You wait for the system to show you its flaw. Gavin Pierce thought he was isolating me. He thought that by shoving me into the dark and taking away my voice, he would make me obsolete. He wanted me to quit. He wanted me to fade away so he could replace me with his shiny new toys and claim he reinvented the wheel. He did not realize that by putting me in the dark, he had given me the perfect vantage point. I was no longer distracted by meetings or politics. I had nothing to do but watch. I watched who went into his office. I watched who signed off on the new sloppy protocols. I watched how they bypassed the safety checks I had installed. I sat in the silence of the annex, listening to the hum of the servers, and I sharpened my attention. They wanted to treat me like a ghost, fine. I would haunt them. I would watch every step they took, and I would wait for them to make the mistake I knew was coming. I did not know yet how they planned to get rid of me, but I knew the axe was falling, and I made a silent promise to the humming servers next to me when they finally swung that axe. I would make sure they cut their own throats in the process. The email announcement landed in my inbox on a Wednesday morning, vibrating with the kind of corporate cheerfulness that usually precedes a disaster. The subject line read, "Welcoming our new visionary leader." I opened it, expecting to see a veteran from a competitor or perhaps an internal promotion of someone who actually knew how to code. Instead, I saw a headshot of a woman who looked like she had just graduated from a sorority rush week. Her name was Sloane Pierce. The email identified her as our new head of operations strategy. I read the name again. Sloane Pierce. I looked up at the glass office across the hall where Gavin Pierce was currently pacing back and forth, talking into his headset. Pierce and Pierce. It was so brazen I almost respected it. In the old days, companies tried to hide nepotism behind different last names or vague consulting contracts, but Gavin was part of this new breed of executive who believed they were kings, and kings do not apologize for appointing princesses. Sloane was 28 years old. I looked her up on LinkedIn. Her previous experience listed 2 years as a brand evangelist for a failed juice startup and a year as a lifestyle consultant, whatever that meant. Now, she was technically my superior. She was in charge of the strategy for a system she could not even log into without help. The first week of Sloane's tenure was a masterclass in performative busyness. She did not ask for a briefing on the PulseRank algorithm. She did not ask to meet the engineering leads. Instead, she sent out a company-wide memo announcing a culture refresh. Her first official act as head of operations strategy was to change the default icons on our Slack channels from standard geometric shapes to what she called vibe indicators. I sat in my annex office, watching the engineering channel fill up with confused emojis. The system I had spent 14 years refining, the system that processed millions of dollars in contracts daily, was now being managed by someone who prioritized the aesthetics of our chat application over the stability of our servers. It was Marcus, a project manager who had been with the company almost as long as I had, who confirmed the obvious. He found me by the coffee machine, pretending to look for sugar packets. "You know, right?" he whispered, keeping his eyes on the hallway. "I can guess," I said, stirring my black coffee. "She is his niece," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "His brother's daughter. Apparently, she needed a soft landing after her fashion blog didn't take off." I did not say anything. I just nodded. I filed that information away in the folder in my brain labeled ammunition. I went back to my desk and continued my work. But now I was listening. I listened to every word she said in the open plan office. I read every email she sent. I was building a profile, not of a colleague, but of a threat. The real trouble started 2 weeks later during the preparation for the Redstone MedTech renewal. Redstone was our biggest client in the healthcare sector. Dealing with them required a surgical understanding of data compliance. You do not mess around with medical records. One wrong move, one unencrypted transfer, and you are looking at federal investigations and fines that can bankrupt a department. We were gathered in the main conference room. Gavin sat at the head of the table, looking like a proud father. Sloane sat next to him, tapping away on an iPad that I suspected was not actually connected to anything. The Redstone representatives were on the large screen, their faces stern and expectant. "We need assurance," the Redstone compliance officer said, his voice crackling over the speakers, "that the new risk scoring module keeps all patient identifiers within the designated sovereign cloud. No cross-border data packet movement, period." It was a standard question. The answer was yes, because I had built the hard-coded geofencing into the module 3 years ago. I opened my mouth to confirm this, to cite the specific security protocols we used, but Sloane spoke first. "Actually," she said, flashing a bright, confident smile at the camera, "we are looking to migrate that data to a more fluid, global server architecture. It will speed up your processing times by 20%. We believe in a borderless approach to data." The room went cold. The Redstone compliance officer looked like he had just swallowed a lemon. "Miss Pierce," the officer said, his voice dropping an octave, "that would be a direct violation of HIPAA regulations and GDPR. If you move that data across borders, we lose our license to operate. Are you suggesting we break federal law to save 3 seconds on a report?" I waited for Gavin to step in. I waited for him to correct her, to explain that she was new and misspoke. Instead, Gavin nodded slowly. "I think what Sloane is getting at," he said, smoothing his tie, "is that we are innovators. We push boundaries. Sloan is just showing you that we are thinking about efficiency at a high level. Excellent leadership. Sloan. Bold thinking. The Redstone team did not look impressed by the bold thinking. They looked terrified. The call ended awkwardly, with a promise to circle back, which in corporate speak means, we are going to look for a new vendor immediately. I returned to my desk and did what any sane professional would do. I wrote a report. I drafted a formal risk assessment, detailing exactly why Sloan's suggestion was not just technically unfeasible, but legally catastrophic. I cited the specific statutes we would be violating. I kept the tone neutral, professional, and devoid of emotion. It was just facts. I sent it to Gavin, copying the legal department, marking it as high priority. Gavin's reply came 4 minutes later. He did not copy it legally. Camilla, the email read, we are trying to build a culture of yes here. We need people who are flexible, not people who look for problems. We do not need complainers. We need visionaries. Let Sloan lead. He was gaslighting me. He was taking a factual warning about breaking the law and twisting it into a personality defect on my part. I stared at the screen, and I felt something shift inside me. The loyalty I had held for this company, the pride I took in keeping the lights on, evaporated. If they wanted to drive the car off a cliff, they were welcome to do it, but I was not going to be in the passenger seat when they hit the bottom. The breaking point came the following Monday at the quarterly all-hands meeting. The entire company was packed into the cafeteria. Gavin stood on a makeshift stage, a microphone in hand, pacing back and forth like a televangelist. Behind him, a massive screen displayed the word meritocracy in bold, sans-serif letters. At Vantage Grid, Gavin bellowed, his voice echoing off the linoleum. We believe that the best ideas win. It does not matter who you are. It does not matter how long you have been here. It matters what you bring to the table. We reward talent. We reward grit. He paused for dramatic effect. I stood near the back, leaning against a pillar, my arms crossed. And that is why, Gavin continued, beaming, I am thrilled to present this quarter's Excellence in Innovation Award to the Operations Strategy Team, led by Sloan Pierce, for their incredible work on revitalizing our internal culture. Sloan walked up to the stage, feigning surprise. She accepted the glass trophy, a heavy, expensive thing, while the screen behind her flashed photos of the new emoji sets she had implemented. The applause was polite but thin. The engineers knew. The support staff knew. We were watching a 28-year-old with zero qualifications accept an award for changing icons while the actual product teetered on the edge of instability. Something inside me snapped. It was not a loud snap. It was the quiet click of a safety catch being released. I pushed off the pillar. I did not raise my hand. I just spoke. My voice was calm, projected clearly across the room thanks to the sudden lull in the applause. Gavin, I said. He looked up, squinting against the stage lights to find me in the crowd. When he saw it was me, his smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Yes, Camilla, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. We usually save Q&A for the end, but go ahead. I just have one question about the core value on the screen behind you, I said, pointing to the word meritocracy. If meritocracy is real, and the best ideas truly win, why did your relative jump straight into a senior executive position that involves overseeing systems I have successfully operated for 14 years? The silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical weight. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Every head in the room turned to look at me, and then whipped back to look at Gavin. The relative part hung in the air like toxic smoke. I had said the quiet part out loud. I had broken the cardinal rule of the corporate court, never point out that the king is naked, and definitely never point out that the princess is only there because of her DNA. Sloan looked down at her shoes, her face flushing a deep crimson. Gavin, to his credit, recovered quickly. The shark smile returned, but now it was tighter, sharper. His eyes were dead cold. Thank you, Camilla, he said, his voice level but laced with venom. For that opinion, We value all perspectives here, even the confused ones. He turned back to the crowd, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. Let us give Sloane another round of applause. The clapping that followed was awkward and disjointed. I did not stay to hear it. I turned and walked out of the cafeteria. My heart was pounding, not with fear, but with adrenaline. I knew what I had done. I had just signed my own death warrant at Vantage Grid Systems. I could smell the retaliation in the air. It smelled like ozone and burnt bridges. I went back to my desk, but I did not work. I started backing up my personal files. I knew I didn't have much time. Gavin was not the type to let a public humiliation slide. He would come for me. He would try to destroy me. But as I watched the data transfer bar creep toward 100%, I smiled. Because while Gavin was planning his petty revenge, he had forgotten one crucial detail. He thought he was the one in control because he had the title. He didn't realize that I was the one holding the keys. And soon, he was going to find out exactly what happens when you lock the architect out of the building. The destruction of a sophisticated software ecosystem does not happen with a bang. It happens with a series of small, arrogant clicks. It started on a Tuesday, 2 days after the all-hands meeting where I had publicly embarrassed Gavin. The retaliation was not direct. Gavin was too smart for a public execution right away. Instead, he sent his optimization team into the Holy of Holies, the source code of the risk reporting engine. I watched the commit log scroll across my second monitor in the annex. It was like watching a group of teenagers break into a museum to spray paint the statues. They were tearing through the architecture I had spent over a decade perfecting, deleting blocks of code they did not understand simply because they looked complicated. I stood up and walked to the main engineering bay. The team was huddled around a monitor, laughing. They were led by a guy named Tyler, one of the new hires who wore limited edition sneakers and wrote code that looked like spaghetti thrown against a wall. "What are you doing to the escalation filter?" I asked. My voice was calm, but my hands were clenched in my pockets. Tyler looked up, unbothered. "Oh, hey Camilla. We are just trimming the fat. This logic loop here. It checks the legal database 3 times before routing a ticket. It is super clunky. We are streamlining it to go straight to ops." I felt a cold drop of sweat slide down my spine. That is not fat. Tyler, that is a safety valve. That loop exists to verify if a client contract has a specific liability clause. If the system detects a breach, it automatically routes the ticket to the legal department before operations even sees it. If you send a liability breach straight to ops, and they reply with the wrong terminology, we violate the contract, we get sued. Tyler rolled his eyes. He looked at me with the pity one might reserve for a confused grandmother. "Camila, look, we get it. You built this stuff a long time ago. But with the new AI wrappers we are installing, we do not need hard-coded paranoia. The system is smart enough to handle it. Besides, speed is the metric now. We need to cut latency." "You cannot optimize compliance," I said, stepping closer. "You are removing the brakes from a race car because you think they make the car heavy." "It's 2025, Tyler said, cutting me off with a smirk that mirrored Gavin's. "We do not code like it is 2010 anymore. We move fast. You should try it." He hit the enter key. The screen flashed green. The changes were deployed. I stared at him for a long moment. I wanted to scream. I wanted to explain that the year on the calendar did not change the laws of logic or the terms of a binding legal agreement, but I saw the look in his eyes. He did not care. He had his orders from Gavin to modernize, and to him, I was just an obstacle to his quarterly bonus. "Mark the timestamp," I said quietly. "What?" Tyler asked, already turning back to his friends. "Mark the timestamp," I repeated. "Because you just broke the Redstone containment protocol." I walked away. I went back to my annex, sat down, and waited. It took exactly 36 hours for the bomb to go off. Redstone MedTech operated on a strict service-level agreement. If their servers flagged a patient data discrepancy, we had 4 hours to acknowledge it and 12 hours to resolve it. Crucially, if the discrepancy involved potential data exposure, Our legal team had to be notified within the first hour to prepare a mandatory disclosure statement. At 8 in the morning on Thursday, a Redstone server threw a critical error code. It was a Type 1 alert, the highest priority. In the old system, my system that alert would have hit the filter I built. The code would have recognized the severity, locked the ticket, and immediately alerted the General Counsel's pager, but Tyler had optimized the filter. So, instead of waking up the General Counsel, the alert bypassed the legal check entirely. It was routed directly to the General Operations inbox. That inbox was currently being managed by Sloan's new team of customer success associates, who were mostly interns. The ticket sat there. An intern saw it, saw the complex medical terminology, and marked it as pending review. 1 hour passed. The legal deadline was missed. 4 hours passed. The service level agreement was breached. 12 hours passed. I was eating a sandwich at my desk when my personal cell phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was the vice president of operations at Redstone. My stomach dropped. They never called personal lines unless the building was burning down. "This is Camila," I answered. "Where the hell is the disclosure?" The voice on the other end was not shouting. It was shaking with a cold, terrifying fury. "We have been sitting on a data exposure alert for 14 hours. Camila, 14 hours. Do you have any idea what the federal fines look like for a 14-hour delay? We are legally required to report within 6. We are exposed. We are completely exposed." I started to speak, but he cut me off. "I trusted you," he hissed. "I told my board that Vantage Grid was safe because Camilla Cruz runs the ship. I look like an idiot. And my company looks like a criminal enterprise. Fix it, now, or you will be hearing from our lawyers before the sun goes down." The line went dead. I sat there in the silence of the annex. I was not the one who deleted the code. I was not the one who ignored the warning. But I was the one apologizing. I was the one feeling the shame burn my face because I was the only one who understood the gravity of what had just happened. The company's reputation was not just cracking, it was shattering. I did not fix it. I couldn't. The damage was already done. The timeline was broken. 10 minutes later, the summons came. An invite popped up on my screen. "Urgent sync. War room. Now." I walked into the conference room. The atmosphere was toxic. There was no coffee on the table, no pastries, no pleasantries. Gavin stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of controlled panic. Sloan sat next to him, looking pale. Tyler and the optimization team were there, looking defensive. "We have a situation with Redstone," Gavin said, his voice tight. "They are claiming we missed a critical deadline. They are threatening to pull the contract." He looked around the room, his eyes sliding over Tyler, over Sloan, and landing squarely on me. "Camilla," Gavin said, "you have been the point of contact for Redstone for years. How did this happen?" I looked at him. I looked at Tyler. "The alert was not routed to legal," I said calmly. "It went to the general inbox. It sat there for 14 hours because the auto filter was removed." "The filter was clunky," Tyler interrupted immediately, his voice shrill. "It was slowing down the system latency. We improved the throughput." "You improved the throughput by removing the safety check," I said. "I told you on Tuesday. I told you specifically that this would happen." "We do not recall any specific warning," Gavin said, cutting me off. His voice was sharp, authoritative. He was rewriting history in real time. "What I am hearing, Camilla, is that you left a legacy system so fragile that a simple modernization update caused a catastrophic failure. It sounds to me like the architecture was the problem, not the update." I opened my mouth to object, to remind them of the conversation, of the logic. "We need agile thinkers," Gavin continued, talking over me. "We cannot have bottlenecks who cling to old methods and then blame the innovation team when things break. You are the bottleneck. Camila, you are the one who made the system so difficult to navigate that my team could not effectively optimize it." The room was silent. Sloan nodded in agreement. Relieved the target was not on her back. Tyler smirked, his confidence restored by the boss's protection. They were pinning it on me. They were blaming the architect for the arsonist's fire. I looked at Gavin. I saw the calculation in his eyes. He knew Tyler screwed up. He knew Sloane's team dropped the ball. But he could not admit that. Admitting that would mean admitting his new hires were incompetent, and his nepotism was dangerous. It was much easier, much cleaner, to blame the legacy employee who was on her way out anyway. I closed my mouth. I did not scream. I did not fight. "I see," I said. My voice was devoid of emotion. "I will return to my desk." "You do that," Gavin said, dismissing me. "We have a mess to clean up." I walked out of the room. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. It was the calm of a soldier who stops trying to save the village and starts loading their weapon. I went back to the annex and locked the door. I did not try to fix the redstone error. It was too late for that. Instead, I opened a blank folder on my encrypted drive. I named it Insurance. I started typing. I pulled the server logs from Tuesday, showing the exact moment Tyler deleted the filter code. I pulled the chat logs where I had explained the function of the legal routing. I pulled the email alerts that had been sent to the general inbox and ignored by Sloane's team. I took screenshots of the JIT commit history, clearly showing Tyler's user ID authorizing the deletion of the safety protocols. I gathered everything, every email, every timestamp, every ignored warning. I downloaded the raw data that proved exactly who broke the system and exactly when they did it. They wanted to call me a bottleneck, fine. They wanted to say I was the problem, fine. I would let them tell their story for now. But I was going to keep the receipts. And when the time came, I was not just going to defend myself. I was going to use this evidence to bury them. The sun went down over the city, casting long shadows across my desk. I worked in the dark, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. I was no longer an employee of Vantage Grid Systems. I was a witness building a case, and the verdict was going to be devastating. The invitation arrived in my inbox at 2 p.m. on a Friday, in the corporate world. Friday afternoon is the executioner's hour. If they want to promote you, they call you in on a Tuesday morning when the week is full of promise. If they want to fire you, they do it on Friday afternoon so you can pack your box while the rest of the office is at happy hour, and they do not have to look you in the eye until Monday. The subject line was 2 words, performance alignment. There was no agenda attached. There were no documents to review. There was just a time slot and a location, the Glass Bowl, the small as soundproof conference room near the elevators. And just to add the final insult to the injury, the invite was addressed to Camilla, 2 L's. I had worked at Vantage Grid for 14 years. My name was on the patent applications for the core technology. My name was in the metadata of the server architecture. And yet, in the final calendar invite of my career, they could not even spell it correctly. It was the 3rd time that month they had made the error. It was not a mistake. It was a message. It said, "You do not matter enough for us to use spell check." I did not panic. I did not hyperventilate. I simply closed my email client. I took my phone, my wallet, and my keys. I left my notebook on the desk. I left my favorite pen. I left the photos of my cat. I wanted to leave the desk looking exactly as it always did, as if I had just stepped away for coffee. It was a small act of defiance. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me pack. I walked to the Glass Bowl. The office was buzzing with the low-frequency energy of the coming weekend. People were laughing near the water cooler. Sloane's team was loudly debating where to get drinks. They did not look at me. I was already a ghost to them. I opened the door and stepped inside. The room was cold. They always crank up the air conditioning for these meetings, as if freezing the temperature will freeze the emotions in the room. Gavin Pierce was sitting at the head of the table. He did not stand up to greet me. He did not smile. He wore the solemn, practiced expression of a man who is about to do something terrible, but wants you to believe it hurts him more than it hurts you. Next to him sat Jade Simmons, the Vice President of Human Resources. Jade was a woman who had trained herself to look empathetic while destroying livelihoods. She had a notepad in front of her and a pen poised to take notes. And there, in the center of the table, was the object I knew would be there. It was a thick, cream-colored folder. I knew exactly what was inside. It was the corporate exile kit. It would contain a separation agreement, a legal release of claims, a non-disparagement clause, and a breakdown of a severance package calculated to be just enough to keep me from suing, but not enough to make me feel valued. I pulled out the chair opposite Gavin and sat down. I did not speak. I folded my hands on the table and waited. The silence stretched. It was a power move. They wanted me to speak first. They wanted me to ask, "What is this about?" So they could take control. I did not give them that. I looked at Gavin. Blinking slowly. Gavin cleared his throat. He tapped the folder with his index finger. "Camilla," he began, mispronouncing my name again. "Thank you for joining us." He paused, waiting for a "You're welcome" that did not come. "We have been reviewing the direction of the company," Gavin continued, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "Vantage Grid is entering a new phase. We are pivoting toward a more agile, high-velocity model. We looked at the team structure, and we looked at the skill sets required for this next chapter." He leaned forward, clasping his hands. This was the part where he would try to frame my competence as a liability. "We need builders. Camilla, we need people who are comfortable breaking things to move fast. We need people who look at the future, not people who are attached to the legacy of the past." He looked at me with a pitying expression, like I was a rotary phone in an era of smartphones. "Unfortunately, we feel that your style does not align with the velocity we are trying to achieve. You are a guardian of the old way, and we need to clear the path for the new way." He pushed the folder toward me. "Effective immediately. Your role is being eliminated." Jade Simmons jumped in right on cue. Her voice was soft, overly sweet, the voice of a kindergarten teacher explaining a timeout. "We have prepared a generous separation package," Jade said. "It includes 3 months of severance and an extension of your health benefits. All we need is your signature on the non-disclosure agreement and the release of claims." She opened the folder and pointed to a line at the bottom of a dense legal document. "We want this to be an amicable transition," Gavin added. "We want to help you find a place where you might be better, fit." I looked at the papers. The NDA was standard but restrictive. It barred me from discussing the internal operations of the company. It barred me from disparaging the leadership. It was a gag order wrapped in a check for 3 months of salary. I looked up at them. I studied their faces. They were tense. They were waiting for their reaction. This was the part of the script where the employee cries, or the part where the employee screams and throws the folder. They were ready for that. Jade had a box of tissues ready on the side table. Gavin had his security team on speed dial. They wanted me to be emotional. If I was emotional, they could write me off as unstable or unprofessional. They could tell themselves that firing me was the right choice because look at how irrational she is. I felt a cold, crystal clear calm wash over me. I was not sad. I was not angry. I was essentially done. I did not touch the folder. I did not pick up the pen. "Is this a final decision?" I asked. My voice was steady, quiet, and devoid of inflection. Gavin blinked. He seemed surprised by the question. "Yes, the decision has been made and approved by the board. And my access to the systems has been revoked," I asked. "It is terminating your credentials as we speak," Jade said, checking her watch. "It is standard procedure." "So I am no longer an employee of Vantage Grid Systems," I stated. "I have no responsibilities here. I have no duty to report errors. I have no obligation to maintain the infrastructure." "That is correct," Gavin said, looking at me with a hint of confusion. "You are free to go." I nodded. It was done. They had cut the cord. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my security badge. It was an old badge. The plastic yellowed with age. It had my picture from 14 years ago on it. I looked so young in that photo. I looked hopeful. I placed the badge gently on the table, right on top of the cream-colored folder. The plastic made a sharp click against the wood. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my jacket. "Then I suggest you call your payroll provider," I said. Gavin frowned. "Excuse me." You said you need builders who are comfortable breaking things, I said, looking him dead in the eye. Well, your builders broke something about 20 minutes ago. I was monitoring the logs when I got your invite. I paused. The room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the projector fan in the ceiling. Tyler's optimization branch just deleted 3 dependencies that link the time logging database directly to the payroll export, I said. He thought they were redundant legacy code. He did not check the load-bearing references. Jade dropped her pen. It clattered loudly onto the table. Her face went pale. She knew what that meant. If the payroll export failed, 2,000 employees would not get paid on Monday. What Gavin said, his confident mask slipping. What are you talking about? The bridge between hours worked and money paid is gone. I said simply, it is a hard-coded dependency I wrote 7 years ago to handle the complex state tax withholdings. It is not there anymore, and since I am no longer an employee, and my access has been revoked, I cannot fix it. Wait, Gavin said, half rising from his chair. If that is true, I need to do nothing, I interrupted. I am not a builder. I am just a legacy bottleneck, remember. I turned toward the door. Camilla, wait, Gavin's voice rose, cracking slightly. The buzzwords were gone. The arrogance was evaporating. Panic was setting in. I did not stop. I did not look back. I opened the heavy glass door and stepped out into the hallway. The office was still loud. People were still laughing. Sloan was still talking about drinks. None of them knew that the financial heart of the company had just stopped beating. None of them knew that their paychecks were currently floating in a digital void. I walked to the elevators. I pressed the down button. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel happy. I felt like a surgeon who had been forced to step away from the operating table in the middle of a procedure. The patient was going to bleed out. I knew exactly how to stitch the artery. I had the needle in my hand, but they had kicked me out of the operating room, so I let them have the room. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors slid shut, I saw Gavin running out of the conference room, his phone pressed to his ear, his face a portrait of pure, unadulterated fear. I exhaled. I was unemployed. I was free, and they were completely blind. The first thing I did when I stepped out of the elevator and into the cool afternoon air of the Seattle street was take my phone out of my pocket. It was buzzing. It had been buzzing since I left the conference room. A frantic, vibrating plea for attention. I looked at the screen. It was Jade Simmons. Then it was Gavin. Then it was the IT director. I did not answer. I slid my thumb across the screen and powered the device down. The screen went black, and the vibration stopped. It was a profound silence. For 14 years, I had been on call. I had answered the phone at dinner parties, at funerals, and during vacations. I had conditioned them to believe that my time was their property. But they had just signed a document stating that I was no longer an employee. They had legally severed the relationship. Answering that phone would have been a violation of the boundaries they had just established. They wanted me gone. So, I was gone. I went home. I poured myself a glass of wine. I sat on my balcony and watched the city lights turn on, knowing that a few miles away, the lights at Vantage Grid were burning for a very different reason. The next morning, Saturday, I sat down at my personal laptop. I did not log into any company servers. I did not touch any proprietary code. I simply opened my email client and drafted a standard form letter. I had a list of about 30 external vendors, partners, and API integrators. People I had cultivated relationships with for over a decade. These were the people who provided the data feeds that fed the PulseRank algorithm. I wrote, "Dear partner, effective immediately. I am no longer with Vantage Grid Systems. Please direct all future technical inquiries, license renewals, and handshake protocol updates to the General Operations Strategy inbox. I can no longer act as your point of contact." It was polite. It was professional. It was also a death sentence. I knew exactly what would happen. I knew that the general inbox was a black hole managed by Sloan's interns. I knew that half of these vendors had security protocols that required a manual confirmation from a trusted IP address, my IP address, every 30 days. I knew that by removing myself as the bridge, I was not blowing up the bridge. I was simply letting gravity take over. I hit send. Then I closed the laptop and went for a long hike. By Monday morning, the bleeding had started. I did not need to be in the office to see it. I could feel it. The ecosystem of a tech company is interconnected. When a node goes dark, it sends ripples through the industry. The first ripple was the license renewal failure. VantageGrid used a third-party security layer for its server clusters. The license key for that layer was set to auto-renew at 8 in the morning on Monday. The script I had written years ago looked for a specific encryption key to verify the transaction. That key was stored in a secure folder within my user profile. But IT wiped my profile on Friday afternoon. At 8 in the morning, the script reached out for the key, found a void, and terminated the handshake. Immediately, the uptime warnings on the main dashboard would have turned a violent, flashing red. The servers, thinking they were under attack or unlicensed, would have gone into lockdown mode. Access to the database would have throttled down to a crawl. I imagined Tyler and his optimization team staring at the screens, frantically typing commands that were being rejected because they did not have the root authority to override a security lockdown. They would be looking for the key, but the map to the key had been in my head. Then came the payroll disaster. I heard about this one later through the grapevine, but I could reconstruct it perfectly in my mind. The payroll export ran at noon. It was supposed to pull the hours from the time logging system, calculate the tax burden using the state-specific logic I had built, and generate a banking file. But Tyler had deleted the dependency. He had severed the link between hours worked and state tax. When the script ran, it hit a null value. In a well-architected system, it would have stopped and thrown an error. But Gavin's team had removed the clunky error checks to make the system faster. So, the script did not stop. It kept running. It entered an infinite loop, subtracting the tax variable over and over again from the base salary. By the time the finance director opened the file, the numbers were catastrophic. The export showed that every single employee at VantageGrid did not just earn $0, they owed the company thousands. The bonus column, which should have been a positive number, was a negative integer so large it looked like a phone number. I could picture the scene in the finance department. The scream from the CFO, the blood drained from Jade Simmons' face as she realized that she had fired the only person who knew how to untangle the spaghetti code of the payroll engine. 2,000 employees were expecting direct deposits on Tuesday. Those deposits were not coming. In the middle of this chaos, the Redstone MedTech dashboard, the crown jewel of Sloane's visual refresh, was behaving exactly as I knew it would. Sloane had spent weeks making the dashboard look modern. She had added gradients, rounded corners, and smooth animations. It looked beautiful. But on Monday afternoon, when Redstone executives logged in to check their risk assessments, they saw a very pretty, very empty screen. The risk module, the engine that processed the compliance data, was returning a blank value. The data was there, buried deep in the database, but the retrieval hook, the logic I had designed to sift through millions of records, was gone. It had been optimized into oblivion. To the client, it looked like their data had been deleted. I sat in a coffee shop downtown, reading a book, when my phone screen lit up with a LinkedIn notification. I had turned my phone back on, but I had blocked all numbers associated with VantageGrid. LinkedIn, however, was open territory. The message was from a developer named Ben. Ben was a good kid, quiet, one of the few who hadn't joined the cult of Gavin. Camilla, the message read, "It is a slaughterhouse here. The payroll file is corrupted. The Redstone dashboard is showing nulls. Gavin is screaming at everyone. He just fired Tyler in the middle of the floor. They are saying you planted a logic bomb. Did you do this? Did you turn off the cluster report on purpose?" I looked at the message. I took a sip of my coffee. I did not reply. I had not planted a bomb. I had not written a single line of malicious code. I had not deleted a single file. A logic bomb implies intent to destroy. I had no intent to destroy it. What they were experiencing was not sabotage, it was the absence of maintenance. It was the sudden removal of the load-bearing wall. They had assumed that the system ran on magic and electricity. They did not realize it ran on the institutional memory of the person they had just discarded. I was the keystone, the glue, the load-bearing wall. I was the person who knew that if you touched the blue wire, the red wire would overheat. I was the person who manually cleared the cache on the legacy server every Thursday because of a memory leak in the hardware that they refused to replace. I was the person who updated the SSL certificates because the automated reminder went to an email address that no longer existed. I did not break their company. I just stopped holding it together. Back at the office, the panic was shifting into hysteria. Gavin was holding back-to-back war room meetings. He was bringing in expensive external consultants, men in suits who charged $400 an hour to look at the code. But these consultants did not know the dialect of our system. They were looking at a novel written in a language they did not speak. They could see the errors, but they could not understand the narrative of the code. They tried to roll back the system to the version from last week, but the optimization team had overwritten the backup protocols to save storage space. There was no clean backup. They were stuck in the broken present. I imagined Gavin standing at the head of the table, his tie loosened, sweat beading on his forehead. He would be demanding names. He would be demanding a fix. He would be looking at Sloane, who was likely shrinking into her chair. Realizing that her culture refresh could not fix database corruption, he would be realizing, slowly and painfully, that he had cut off the head of the organization and was now surprised that the body was thrashing around. I finished my coffee. I felt a strange lightness. For the first time in 14 years, the stress of the uptime alerts was not mine. The fear of the payroll bug was not mine. The anger of the client was not mine. I was a civilian. I walked out of the coffee shop. I had a meeting to prepare for. A meeting that had nothing to do with VantageGrid, yet had everything to do with the asset they had ignored. I checked my watch. It was 2 p.m. The banks were closing soon. The payroll deadline was approaching. The Redstone lawyers were likely drafting their breach of contract notices, and I was going to go to the grocery store. The silence from my end was the loudest noise in their world. They were screaming into the void, and the void was not screaming back. It was just watching and waiting, because I knew the next step. I knew that eventually, the consultants would give up. I knew that the legal threats from Redstone would land on Gavin's desk, and I knew that, inevitably, the pride would break. They would have to reach out, not with a command, but with a plea, and when they did, they would find that the price of the key had gone up significantly since Friday afternoon. The silence that had settled over my life for the last 48 hours was broken not by a scream, but by a chime. It was the gentle, non-threatening sound of a priority email landing in my personal inbox. I was sitting in my living room, surrounded by the quiet comfort of my own space. The television was on, playing a documentary about deep-sea predators on mute. I found it fitting. I picked up my phone and looked at the notification. It was from the legal department at VantageGrid Systems. The subject line was carefully constructed to look mundane. Regarding transition services and advisory scope. I opened it. The body of the email was a masterpiece of corporate desperation masked as professional courtesy. It was written by the general counsel, a man named Robert, who usually only emailed me when he needed to blame someone for a compliance audit. "Dear Ms. Cruz," the email began, "we hope this message finds you well. In light of the recent restructuring and your departure, we have identified several legacy protocols that require a specialized handover. We would like to offer you a short-term advisory agreement to assist with this transition. We are prepared to offer a competitive hourly rate for your time over the next 2 weeks to ensure business continuity." I read it twice. Legacy protocols, business continuity. They were still using the same buzzwords. Even as the house burned down around them, they were trying to hire me back as a consultant to fix the disaster they had created. But they were terrified of admitting that it was a disaster. They wanted me to come in quietly, patch the holes, and leave again so they could pretend nothing had happened. I did not reply. I placed the phone face down on the coffee table. 20 minutes later, A second email arrived. This one was heavier. It came from the audit committee of the board of directors. Ms. Cruz, it read, the audit committee is conducting an emergency review of the current operational outages affecting the Redstone MedTech account. We have reviewed the logs and identified significant gaps in the system architecture following your departure. We would appreciate 30 minutes of your time to clarify the ownership structure of the risk assessment module. Please let us know when you are available. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile. They had finally found it. They had finally reached the bottom of the rabbit hole and realized that the rabbit was actually a wolf. Gavin and Sloan believed that everything inside the walls of VantageGrid belonged to VantageGrid. That is the standard assumption of the corporate conqueror. They assume that if it runs on their servers, they own the code. They assume that every line of logic was written by a salaried drone whose intellectual property rights were signed away on day one. But Gavin and Sloan had never bothered to read the contracts, and crucially, they had fired the procurement team, the only people who actually knew where the bodies were buried during their first week of cost-saving measures. If they had kept the procurement lead, she would have told them about Cruz Signalworks LLC. I leaned back in my chair and let the memory wash over me. It was 6 years ago. VantageGrid was going through a different crisis back then, a budget crisis. We needed a sophisticated client scoring engine to handle the new healthcare contracts. The existing market solutions were expensive. Salesforce wanted $2 million a year. Oracle wanted $3 million. The old CTO, a man who actually understood the value of a dollar, had thrown his hands up in despair. We cannot afford the vendor fees, he had told me, but we cannot operate without risk protection. I had come to him with a proposal. I told him I had been working on a side project at home, on my own personal server, on my own time. It was a predictive modeling engine. I called it PulseRank. I will license it to you, I said. I will not sell you the code. I will not assign the copyright to VantageGrid. I will retain full ownership through my private LLC, but I will grant VantageGrid a perpetual, non-exclusive license to use the core module, provided that the maintenance contract is renewed annually. The CTO had agreed. It was a steal for them. They got a world-class system for a fraction of the market price. The legal department drew up the papers. I signed as the owner of Cruz Signalworks LLC. They signed as the licensee. For 6 years. It worked perfectly. I updated the system. I managed the integration. The annual renewal was a rubber stamp formality that went through procurement. But then Gavin arrived. When Gavin and his optimization team looked at the system, they did not see a licensed third-party tool. They just saw a module sitting in the stack. They saw PulseRank and assumed it was just another internal legacy system named by some bored engineer. So, when they fired me, and when they wiped my credentials, they did something else they didn't realize. They severed the handshake between the VantageGrid servers and the Cruz Signalworks license server. PulseRank had a built-in dead man's switch. It was a piece of code I had written to protect my intellectual property. Every 48 hours, the module pinged my private server to verify that the authorized user me was still administering the system. If the ping failed, or if the administrative credentials were deleted, PulseRank didn't delete itself. That would be malicious. Instead, it simply reverted to demo mode. In demo mode, PulseRank stopped processing live data. It stopped calculating risk scores. It stopped flagging compliance violations. It simply outputs null values. This was what was happening to Redstone. The dashboard wasn't broken. The code wasn't buggy. The engine had simply been turned off because the driver had been thrown out of the car. I picked up my phone again. I looked at the email from the audit committee. Ownership structure. Those 2 words told me everything. The lawyers had finally dug up the old procurement files. They had found the contract. They were staring at a document that said, in black and white, that the core technology powering their biggest client did not belong to them. It belonged to the woman they had just escorted out of the building with a security guard. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain was beginning to fall against the glass, blurring the lights of the city. I was not going to destroy them. I had no interest in being a hacker or a saboteur. I had respected the law every step of the way. I had honored my employment contract. I had honored my NDA. But they had violated the license agreement of Cruise Signal Works LLC by attempting to modify the core code which Tyler and his team had tried to optimize. They had breached the terms of service. By firing the administrator, they had voided the support clause. I was not holding their data hostage. I was simply a vendor who had been mistreated. I imagined the scene in the boardroom right now. The general counsel would be reading the contract aloud to the board. Gavin would be sitting there, his face draining of color as he realized that the legacy junk he had mocked was actually a rented engine that he didn't know how to drive. Sloane would be looking at her phone, realizing that her culture refresh had just cost the company its intellectual foundation. They needed the key. And the key was not in the server room. It was not in the cloud. It was in my head. I sat back down at my laptop. I did not reply to the emails immediately. I let them wait. I let the silence stretch for another hour. In negotiation, silence is the most expensive commodity you can trade. Every minute that ticked by was another dollar lost, another reputation fractured, another panic attack in the C-suite. Finally, I opened a reply to the audit committee. I did not copy Gavin. I did not copy HR. I addressed it directly to the chairman of the audit committee. "Dear Sir," I typed, "I am in receipt of your inquiry regarding the Pulse Rank module. As the sole proprietor of Cruise Signal Works LLC, I must inform you that Vantage Grid Systems is currently in violation of our licensing agreement due to unauthorized modification of the source code and the termination of the designated system administrator. However, I am open to a discussion regarding a new service agreement to restore functionality. My legal counsel will forward a proposed meeting time." I hit send. I was not going back as an employee. I was not going back as a consultant. I was going back as a business partner. And business partners do not get fired with calendar invites. They get paid. I closed the laptop. The twist was not that I had stolen the code. The twist was that they had never owned it. They had built their castle on land they were renting from the gardener, and they had just made the mistake of firing the gardener. Now, the rent was due, and I intended to collect every single penny. The meeting place I selected was the lounge of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. It was neutral ground, expensive, and public enough to prevent a scene, yet quiet enough to conduct the kind of business that involves seven-figure implications. I arrived 20 minutes early. I ordered sparkling water with a twist of lime and selected a table near the corner, one with a clear view of the entrance but shielded by a large, decorative fern. I did not sit with my back to the wall because I was afraid. I sat there because I wanted to see them coming. At 2 minutes before 3 in the afternoon, Gavin Pierce walked in. He was accompanied by Jade Simmons from HR. The change in their demeanor from our last meeting, the execution in the glass bowl, was palpable. Gavin was still wearing a suit that cost more than my first car, but it looked like he had slept in it. His tie was slightly askew, and the confident, shark-like tan seemed to have faded into a grayish pallor. Jade looked even worse. She clutched her briefcase to her chest like a shield, her eyes darting around the room as if she expected a subpoena server to jump out from behind the curtains. They spotted me and approached. I did not stand up. I did not offer my hand. I simply gestured to the 2 empty chairs opposite me. "Camilla," Gavin said, his voice straining for a tone of casual familiarity that he had never earned. "Good to see you. Thank you for making the time." "Ms. Cruz?" I corrected him gently. "I am here as the managing director of Cruise Signal Works LLC. Let us keep the titles accurate to the legal standing." Gavin winced. It was a small flinch, a tightening of the jaw. But I saw it. He sat down, and Jade followed suit, opening her notebook with trembling hands. "Right," Gavin said, clearing his throat. "Ms. Cruz, look, we have had a chaotic week. I think we can all agree that the transition process had some friction. We have identified some gaps in the operational continuity that we believe you can help us bridge." He paused, waiting for me to soften, to nod, to offer him an easy way out. I remained perfectly still, watching him over the rim of my glass. "We want to talk about recognition." Gavin continued, revving up the corporate speak engine. We realized that perhaps there was an oversight regarding the complexity of the legacy systems. We want to bring you back into the fold to oversee the stabilization. We are prepared to offer a contract to get us through this patch. We want to realign. It was fascinating. Even now, with his company bleeding money and his biggest client drafting a lawsuit, he could not say the words "I was wrong." He could not say "I fired you" without checking the load-bearing walls. He called it an oversight. He called it friction. He was trying to frame my reinstatement as a favor he was doing for me. "I appreciate the sentiment, Gavin," I said. My voice was level, professional, and devoid of warmth. "But let us be clear about the situation. You are not bringing me back into the fold. I have no interest in being an employee of Vantage Grid Systems ever again. That bridge was burned on Friday afternoon." I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin, black folder. I placed it on the marble table and slid it across to him. "This is a proposal for vendor services," I said. "Cruise Signal Works, LLC, is prepared to offer a 6-month consulting engagement to restore the pulse rank module and stabilize the payroll dependencies. These are the terms." Gavin opened the folder. Jade leaned in to look. I watched their eyes scan the single page I had prepared. I saw Gavin's eyes widen. I saw Jade stop breathing for a moment. "This—" Gavin looked up, his face flushing. "Camilla, this is absurd. These rates are triple what you were making as a salaried employee. And this retainer fee, this is more than we pay the external auditors." "The rates reflect the specialized nature of the work," I said calmly, "and the urgency of the crisis. You are not paying for my time. Gavin, you are paying for the 14 years of knowledge that you tried to delete. You are paying for the solution to the Redstone breach. And these conditions," Gavin said, his finger stabbing at the paper. "Consultant reports directly to the audit committee of the board. No interference from internal operations management. Full, unrestricted administrative access to the codebase with zero oversight from the optimization team. You are effectively asking to run the department from the outside." "I am asking for the authority to fix what you broke," I replied. "I cannot repair the foundation if your optimization team is still trying to knock down the walls. Those are my terms. 6 months. Total autonomy. Direct reporting line to the board. And the fee is non-negotiable." Gavin slammed the folder shut. The noise caused a few people at nearby tables to look over. "This is not a negotiation," he hissed, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "This is a ransom note. You are taking advantage of a temporary glitch to squeeze us. These numbers are incredibly ambitious, even for you." I looked him dead in the eye. I did not blink. "Ambitious." I repeated the word, tasting it. "You think this is ambitious? Ambitious is firing the person who operates the spine of your company because you wanted to give her job to your niece. Ambitious is ignoring 3 written warnings about compliance violations. Ambitious is thinking you can run a technology company without understanding the technology." Gavin's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The truth hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. "I am not squeezing you. Gavin," I continued, "I am offering you a life raft. You can pay the invoice, or you can explain to Redstone why their data is gone forever. It is a business decision. Make it—" Gavin stared at me. He looked ready to explode. I could see the refusal forming on his lips. He was going to walk away. His ego was too big to write that check. He would rather burn the company to the ground than admit defeat to the woman he had discarded. "We cannot authorize this," Gavin said, leaning back and crossing his arms. "The board will never sign off on a consultant with this level of power. It violates our governance structure. We will find another vendor. We will sue you for the code if we have to." "Actually," a deep voice said from the table directly behind me. "I do not think that will be necessary." Gavin froze. His eyes locked on something over my shoulder. I did not turn around. I knew who it was. I had sent him the location of the meeting an hour ago. A man stood up and walked around the fern. He was in his 60s, with silver hair and a suit that whispered old money. It was Arthur Sterling, the chairman of the audit committee. He had been sitting there the entire time, drinking tea and reading a newspaper. Mr. Sterling? Jade squeaked. She looked like she might faint. Gavin, Arthur Sterling said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. I have reviewed the contract provided by Ms. Cruz's legal counsel regarding the ownership of PulseRank. It appears watertight, and I have just heard her offer. It seems like a very reasonable price to pay to avoid a federal investigation and a shareholder lawsuit. Gavin looked like he had just swallowed a hot coin. He sputtered, trying to stand up, trying to regain some semblance of control. Arthur, I did not know you were. This is a sensitive negotiation. It is not a negotiation, Sterling said, looking down at Gavin with cold disappointment. It is a rescue mission, and frankly, Gavin, given the reports I have received from finance about the payroll disaster, you are in no position to negotiate anything. Sterling turned to me. He extended a hand. Ms. Cruz, he said, on behalf of the board, we accept your terms, all of them. The retainer will be wired to your LLC account by the close of business today. You report to me now. I shook his hand. It was a firm, dry handshake. Thank you. Mr. Sterling, I can have the redstone patch deployed by tomorrow morning, provided I have access. Sterling turned back to Gavin. Give her the access. Gavin. Now. But, Gavin started. Now, Sterling repeated. It was a command, not a request. Gavin looked at me. For the first time, I saw the arrogance completely vanish, replaced by a hollow, terrified realization. He had lost. He had not just lost the argument. He had lost the war. He pulled out his phone. His fingers fumbled as he typed the message to it. It is done, Gavin said, his voice barely a whisper. Your credentials are restored. Admin level. Thank you, I said. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not say, I told you so. When you truly win, when you have completely outmaneuvered your opponent, you do not need to dance on their grave. The silence does the work for you. I picked up the folder. I picked up my purse. I will send over the countersigned contract electronically, I said to Sterling. I expect the first payment confirmation before I type a single line of code. You will have it, Sterling promised. I turned to leave. I walked past Gavin, who was staring at the table, and past Jade, who was staring at Gavin. I walked out of the lounge, across the lobby, and through the revolving doors. The air outside was crisp and cool. I took a deep breath. I checked my phone. A notification from my bank app popped up. The retainer had already hit. It was a very large number. I hailed a taxi. I had work to do. But for the first time in a long time, I was not doing it because I was afraid of losing my job. I was doing it because I was the only one who could. I was the expert. I was the vendor. And it was expensive. I did not ask for a corner office. When I returned to Vantage Grid Systems the following morning, Jade Simmons offered me the large, glass-walled suite that had previously belonged to the VP of Sales. It had a panoramic view of the Sound and an espresso machine that cost more than my first apartment. I declined it. I told her I did not need a view. I needed a hardline Ethernet connection and a door that locked. I took a small, windowless room near the server farm on the 4th floor. It was the kind of room usually reserved for storage or interns, but it had the lowest latency in the building. I set up my laptop, connected my mechanical keyboard, and poured a cup of black coffee. I was not there to be comfortable. I was there to be effective. The first thing I did was open the terminal. The screen blinked with the familiar green cursor against a black background. To Gavin and his optimization team, this screen was a terrifying void of cryptic commands. To me, it was home. I started with the license handshake. It was the bleeding artery that was killing the uptime metrics. I navigated to the root directory and pulled up the authentication logs. It was immediately obvious what had happened. When they wiped my user profile, they had deleted the local SSL certificate that verified the Cruise SignalWorks license. The server was screaming out for a handshake, and it was getting a cold shoulder. It took me exactly 10 minutes to fix what the consultants had spent 2 weeks staring at. I did not rewrite the code. I simply generated a new cryptographic key pair, authorized it through my LLC's remote server, and updated the path in the config file. I typed one final command: systems hetal restart pulse service. I waited. The cursor blinked once, twice, then a stream of text cascaded down the screen. Status active, license verified, uptime 100%. I leaned back in my chair. The red lights on the dashboard across the hall turned green. It was not magic. It was not a miracle. It was just competence. Next, I turned to the legal filter. This was the issue that had nearly cost the company the Redstone account. I pulled up the source code for the escalation matrix. I could see the clumsy edits Tyler's team had made. They had commented out the entire logic block for the legal review because they thought it was creating latency. They had traded safety for speed and ended up with a crash. I uncommented the block. I updated the routing table to point to the current general counsel's priority inbox. I added a failsafe that would freeze any ticket containing the keywords HIPAA, breach, or liability until a lawyer manually signed off on it. I committed the changes. The system absorbed them instantly. I opened my email client and composed a message to the VP of Operations at Redstone MedTech. I did not apologize. Apologies are for people who make mistakes. I offered a solution. The Pulse Rank Risk module is fully operational. I wrote, the legal compliance filter has been restored and reinforced with a secondary failsafe. Your data is secure. The dashboard should reflect live values within 60 seconds. I hit send at 9:14 in the morning. The reply came at 9:22, 8 minutes. Thank you. Camilla, the email read. Finally, someone speaks the language. We are standing down the legal team, but we expect a full root cause analysis by Friday. I closed the email. That was the difference between me and Gavin. Gavin sold visions. I sold uptime. By noon. The atmosphere in the building had shifted. It was subtle at first, like the change in air pressure before a storm clears. I walked to the break room to refill my water bottle, and I noticed that people were standing differently. The project managers were no longer huddled in frantic circles, whispering about timelines they could not meet. The developers were not staring at their screens with that glazed, hopeless look of people trying to fix a bug they do not understand. Marcus, the senior PM, stopped me in the hallway. He looked like he had slept for the first time in a month. Is it true? He asked, keeping his voice low. Is the payroll export fixed? It is running now, I said. I relinked the tax dependencies. The file will be at the bank by 2 o'clock. Everyone gets paid tomorrow. Marcus let out a breath that sounded like a deflating tire. Thank you, he said. Seriously, thank you. He did not treat me like an outsider. He did not treat me like a vendor. He treated me like a savior. The innovation team was nowhere to be seen. I suspected they were hiding in their open-concept workspace, terrified that I would come over and ask them to explain their code commits. But I did not have time for petty shaming. I had a job to do. However, there was one person who was conspicuously absent from the recovery process. Gavin Pierce. In a normal company, the CEO would be on the front lines during a crisis of this magnitude. He would be in the war room, asking questions, offering support, or at least pretending to lead. But Gavin had vanished. He was physically in the building. I could see his coat in his office, but he had removed himself from the workflow completely. Every request I made was routed through Jade in HR. If I needed server clearance, Jade approved it. If I needed a budget for a cloud patch, Jade signed the form. Gavin was using her as a human shield. He was terrified of interacting with me. He knew that every time I fixed something, it was proof of his incompetence. He knew that I was currently the most powerful person in the building, not because of my title, but because I was the only one who knew how to turn the lights back on. I sat in my small room, watching the logs scroll by, and I realized something. Gavin was not just useless. He was dangerous. He was the one who had authorized the reckless changes. He was the one who had overridden the safety protocols. And technically, as the CEO, he still had root access to the system. He had the God key that allowed him to modify, delete, or override anything in the infrastructure. I thought about the last few weeks. I thought about the ego, the refusal to listen, the desperate need to look like a visionary, even if it meant blinding the company. I realized that as long as Gavin had that key, the system was at risk. He might try to help again. He might try to delete evidence. He might try to lock me out to save face. This was not about revenge. Revenge is emotional. Revenge is messy. This was about risk management. I was a risk analyst. My job was to identify threats and neutralize them, and Gavin Pierce was a threat. I opened the administrative panel. This was the deepest level of the system, the permission tree that controlled who could do what within the digital borders of VantageGrid. I scrolled down the list of users. System Admin C, Cruise Restored CTO, Vacant CEO, G, Pierce. I clicked on his profile. The permissions list was long. He had read access, write access, and delete access. He had the ability to deploy code to production without review. He had the ability to wipe the user logs. It was a security nightmare. No executive should have that level of access, especially one who couldn't write a Hello World script in Python. I moved my cursor to the checkbox labeled Root Administrator. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a surge of malicious joy. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of correcting a variable in an equation. I clicked the box. The checkmark disappeared. I then moved to Write Access. I unchecked it. I moved to Deploy to Production. I unchecked it. I left him with read-only access. He could look at the dashboards. He could read the reports. He could see the beautiful green uptime numbers that I was generating, but he could not touch them. He could not break them. He was now a passenger in his own car. I clicked Save Changes. The system prompted me for a confirmation. You are about to modify the privileges of a C-level executive. This action will be logged. Do you wish to proceed? I typed my password. I hit Enter. Permissions updated. I closed the panel. I exhaled slowly. It was still warm. Down the hall, in the glass office, Gavin Pierce was probably staring at his screen, wondering why his edit button had just turned gray. He would not call it. He would not storm into my office. He would not say a word. Because if he complained, he would have to admit that he was trying to meddle in a system he had promised the board he would leave to me. He was trapped in a cage of his own making. I had not fired him. I had just taken the batteries out of his remote control. I turned back to my work. I had a few more dependency links to clean up before the end of the day. The building was quiet. The servers were humming, and for the first time in months, VantageGrid Systems was actually working. The system was healthy, but the air in the building was sick. For 3 days, I worked in my windowless room, restoring the digital heartbeat of VantageGrid Systems. The servers were humming with a consistent, rhythmic stability. The Redstone dashboard was green. The payroll files were processed without a single error. By every technical metric, I had saved the company. But in the corridors, a different kind of virus was spreading. It started as a whisper near the coffee machines. Then it moved to the private Slack channels that I could not see. Finally, it bled out into the open. The rumor was specific, malicious, and clearly orchestrated. Camila is not just fixing the code, the whispers said. She is harvesting it. She is stealing proprietary logic to sell it to a competitor. I knew exactly where it came from. Sloane Pierce. Sloane was drowning. Her culture refresh was a joke. Her optimization was a disaster. And her authority had been stripped away by the very person she had tried to replace. She needed a villain to distract from her own incompetence. So, she decided to paint me as a corporate spy. Gavin Pierce knew it was a lie. He knew I was the most ethically rigid person in the building, but he did not stop her. He walked through the office with his eyes fixed on the floor, letting the slander propagate. His silence was not neutral. It was a cowardly endorsement. He hoped that if they threw enough mud at me, some of it would cover up his own stains. The escalation happened on a Thursday afternoon. An anonymous email was sent to the entire board of directors. It was forwarded to the legal department and blind copied to the executive team. Naturally, I was not included. but when you control the admin panel, you see everything that travels through the server. The email read, "Urgent whistleblower report. The external consultant, Camilla Cruz, is currently in active negotiations with a foreign entity to sell VantageGrid's core risk algorithms. She is violating her NDA and using her privileged access to exfiltrate trade secrets. Immediate action is required." I read the email on my monitor. My pulse did not quicken. In fact, I felt a strange sense of alignment. They had finally made their move. It was a dirty, desperate, and legally dangerous move, and it was partially true. That is the best kind of trap, the one that relies on a half-truth. I was speaking to a foreign entity. I had been in late-night Zoom calls with Nordvale Compliance, a massive European conglomerate based in Zurich. They were looking for a new risk engine to handle their GDPR requirements. We were discussing terms. We were discussing a price tag that had 6 zeros attached to it. But the anonymous email got one thing wrong. I was not selling VantageGrid secrets. I was selling my own property. 30 minutes after the email circulated, the summons arrived. It was not a calendar invite this time. It was a phone call from the General Counsel's secretary. Her voice was stiff. "Ms. Cruz, the board requires your presence in the main boardroom immediately for transition planning." Transition planning. That was the code word for an interrogation. I picked up my laptop. I picked up the thick leather portfolio I had brought with me every day since my return. I walked through the office. The heads of the junior developers turned to watch me pass. They looked at me with a mixture of awe and fear. They had heard the rumors. They thought they were watching a thief walking to the gallows. I entered the boardroom. The atmosphere was cold enough to preserve tissue samples. The blinds were drawn. The long mahogany table was occupied by the full audit committee, including Arthur Sterling. Gavin sat at the far end, looking pale and sweaty. Sloane sat next to him, her arms crossed. A look of triumphant vindictiveness plastered on her face. She thought this was it. She thought she had me cornered. There were no water bottles on the table. There were no pleasantries. A man I did not recognize sat next to the general counsel. He wore a suit that cost more than my house and had the dead eyes of a litigator who specialized in destroying lives. "Sit down, Ms. Cruz," the general counsel said. I sat. I placed my portfolio on the table. I folded my hands. "We have received disturbing reports," the litigator began. He did not introduce himself. He just launched the attack. "We have reason to believe that you are in breach of your non-disclosure agreement and your consulting contract. We have information suggesting you are soliciting offers for the sale of VantageGrid's proprietary technology to an overseas competitor." He leaned forward, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. "Are you, or are you not, in negotiations to sell the PulseRank algorithm?" he asked. The room went silent. Gavin looked at me, his eyes wide. He was praying for me to confess. He was praying for me to be the villain so he could be the hero who caught me. I looked at the litigator, then I looked at Arthur Sterling. "I am currently in negotiations with Nordvale Compliance regarding a licensing agreement for the PulseRank engine," I said clearly. A collective gasp went around the room. Sloane smirked. She actually hit the table with her hand, a small gesture of victory. "She admits it," Sloane said, her voice shrill. "She is stealing our IP." "That is a direct violation of your contract," the litigator said, reaching for a stack of papers. "We will be terminating your engagement immediately, and we will be filing a civil suit for damages and theft of trade secrets. We will also be contacting the authorities regarding industrial espionage." "You can do that," I said, my voice remaining perfectly level. "But you would be filing a suit based on a fundamental misunderstanding of property law." "Excuse me," the litigator snapped. "I am not selling VantageGrid's property," I said. "I am selling the property of Cruz Signal Works, LLC." "It is the same thing," Gavin blurted out. "You developed it here. It is on our servers." "No, Gavin," I said, turning to face him. "It is not." I opened my leather portfolio. I took out 4 distinct piles of documents and laid them out on the mahogany table like a winning poker hand. "Exhibit A," I said, sliding the first document toward Arthur Sterling. "The original licensing agreement. signed 6 years ago by your former CTO. It explicitly states that the PulseRank source code remains the sole intellectual property of Cruise Signal Works LLC. VantageGrid was granted a non-exclusive, revocable license to use the software, not to own it. Sterling picked up the document. He put on his reading glasses. The room was deathly quiet. Exhibit B, I continued, sliding the second stack. 6 years of invoices and payment confirmations, every year. VantageGrid pays a licensing fee to my LLC. These payments were approved by finance. They are classified in your own ledger as software vendor fees, not employee salary. You do not pay vendor fees for something you own. I looked at the litigator. He had stopped reaching for his papers. He was now looking at Gavin with a very dangerous expression. Exhibit C, I said. An email from your own finance department, dated 2 months ago, confirming a temporary extension of the license while the renewal was being processed, a renewal that Gavin's team neglected to sign. I paused. I let that sink in. And finally, I said, placing the last document in the center of the table. This is the most interesting one. It was a printout of the server logs from the day I was fired. When I was terminated, Gavin Pierce instructed the IT department to scrub my user profile, but he also personally attempted to access the procurement database. These logs show a user with his credentials trying to delete the vendor record for Cruise Signal Works LLC. I pointed to the highlighted lines on the page. He tried to erase the existence of the vendor relationship. He tried to make it look like the code was internal. Why would a CEO try to delete a vendor contract unless he intended to claim ownership of something that did not belong to him? I looked at Gavin. He was not just sweating now, he was shaking. He looked like a man who had been caught trying to steal a car in a police station parking lot. That is a misinterpretation, Gavin stammered. I was cleaning up the database. Optimization. You were trying to steal my company, I said coldly. And now you are accusing me of theft because I am selling my own product to a buyer who actually respects contracts. I turned back to the board. So, to answer your question, I said to the litigator, no, I am not selling your algorithm. I am selling mine. VantageGrid is currently using the PulseRank engine on a temporary emergency basis because I was gracious enough to turn it back on. But you do not own it. You never did. And judging by the accusations you just leveled at me, I am beginning to wonder if I should revoke that emergency license right now. Arthur Sterling lowered the contract. He looked at the signature on the bottom. Then he looked at the payment records. Then he looked at Gavin. The silence that followed was not the silence of a library. It was the silence of an execution chamber right before the lever was pulled. Sloane's face had lost all its color. She realized, perhaps for the first time in her life, that her uncle could not protect her from facts. She had accused a vendor of stealing their own product. She had triggered a legal review that exposed the company's massive liability. Mr. Pierce, Arthur Sterling said. His voice was soft, but it had an edge that could cut glass. Did you attempt to delete these procurement records? Arthur, I can explain, Gavin said, his voice cracking. The system was complex. I thought it was a duplicate file. You thought a 6-year licensing agreement worth hundreds of thousands of dollars was a duplicate file? Sterling asked. Gavin did not answer. There was no answer. The litigator closed his folder. He pushed his chair back. He looked at me with a newfound respect, or perhaps fear. Ms. Cruz, the litigator said, I think we need to take a short recess. Take all the time you need, I said. But remember, my negotiations with Nordvale are moving quickly. And once I sign an exclusive deal with them, I will be legally obligated to terminate all other licenses, including yours. I sat back. I watched them. The trap they had set for me had snapped shut. But I wasn't the one caught in the teeth. They were, and as I looked at Gavin's terrified face, I knew that the checkmate was inevitable. The recess did not last long. When the board members returned to the room, the atmosphere had shifted from an interrogation to a funeral service. The litigator, who had been ready to tear me apart 20 minutes ago, was now sitting quietly with his hands folded, looking anywhere but at me. Arthur Sterling remained standing. He held a new document in his hand. It was not one of the papers I had provided. It was something else entirely. Something bound in a gray cover with the logo of an external forensic auditing firm. I decided to break the silence. I decided to dictate the terms of their surrender. "Here is the reality," I said, my voice cutting through the thick air of the room. "The bridge license for the PulseRank algorithm expires in exactly 14 days. Gavin's team missed the renewal window 3 months ago. Currently, you are operating on a grace period that I can revoke with a single keystroke. So, VantageGrid has 2 options." I held up 2 fingers. "Option 1, you purchase a perpetual enterprise license for the algorithm. The valuation will be determined by an independent third party, based on the revenue it generates for your Redstone account. It will be expensive, but you will own the rights to use it." I lowered 1 finger. "Option 2, the contract expires. I turned off the server. You lose the ability to process risk assessments for Redstone, or anyone else. You explain to your shareholders why the core product of this company has suddenly evaporated." Gavin slammed his hand on the table. The sound was desperate, hollow. "This is blackmail," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She is holding the company hostage. You cannot let her do this, Arthur. She is extorting us for doing her job." Arthur Sterling turned his head slowly to look at Gavin. His expression was not one of anger, but of absolute, freezing disdain. "That is not blackmail, Gavin," Sterling said. "That is commerce. Blackmail is firing the person who operates the engine and then demanding they fix it for free when the car breaks down. What Ms. Cruz is doing is called leverage. And frankly, she has all of it." Sterling opened the gray folder in front of him. "However," Sterling continued, "we have a more pressing issue than the licensing fee. While the legal team was reviewing Ms. Cruz's contract during the recess, the independent auditors we hired last week completed their review of your optimization project." Gavin went very still. Sloane, sitting next to him, stopped breathing. "We found some interesting anomalies in the vendor selection process," Sterling said, flipping a page. "It appears that the consulting firm you hired to replace Ms. Cruz's team, a company called Nexus Stream, was granted a vendor priority status without a competitive bidding process. They have billed us 3 times the standard market rate for their services, and their services, as we have seen, resulted in a total system failure." Sterling looked up, his eyes locking onto Sloane. "But the most interesting part is the ownership structure of Nexus Stream. It is registered to a holding company in Delaware, and the primary beneficiary of that holding company is Mr. Julian Pierce." I watched the color drain from Sloane's face. "That would be your brother-in-law. Is that correct?" "Sloane?" Sterling asked. The room was silent. The air pressure seemed to drop. This was the twist that nobody saw coming, except perhaps the auditors who followed the money. The optimization team was not just incompetent, it was a grift. Gavin and Sloane had fired me not just to put a family member in charge, but to funnel company money into a family member's pocket. "That is a coincidence," Gavin stammered. "We chose them for their agile methodology." "You chose them to loot the budget," Sterling corrected him sharply. "And in doing so, you destroyed the operational integrity of this firm." Sterling turned to the board secretary. "Read the decision." The secretary stood up. "Effective immediately. CEO Gavin Pierce is placed under administrative leave pending a full governance review. All executive authorities are suspended. Sloane Pierce is suspended without pay pending an investigation into conflict of interest and fraud. Security will escort both parties from the building upon the conclusion of this meeting." Gavin looked like he had been shot. He slumped back in his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. Sloane looked down at her hands, tears of humiliation starting to form. They had come here to destroy me. Instead, they had destroyed themselves. The litigator cleared his throat. He looked at me with a pained expression. "Ms. Cruz," he said, "given these revelations, the board is prepared to accept your offer. We will purchase the license. However, we need to discuss exclusivity. We cannot have this algorithm sold to our competitors. We need to lock down the intellectual property. I smiled. It was a sad smile. Really. Because they still didn't get it. They thought money could fix the timing. I am afraid that is impossible, I said. Everything has a price, the litigator said. Not this, I replied. You see, when I was accused of selling secrets earlier, I told you I was in negotiations. That was technically true. But the negotiation phase ended this morning at 6 o'clock. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out one final document. It was bound in blue. This is a signed agreement with Nordvale Compliance, I said. It grants them an exclusive international license to the PulseRank algorithm for the European and Asian markets. Effective the first day of the next quarter, they paid the asking price, they did not haggle, and most importantly, they respected the contract. I looked at Gavin. He was staring at the blue folder. He understood exactly what this meant. VantageGrid had just lost the global war. They would be trapped in the domestic market, using a leased engine, while a massive European competitor used my technology to dominate the rest of the world. You sold it, Gavin whispered. You sold our future. I sold my product, I corrected him. You had 6 years to buy it. Gavin, you had 6 years to treat me like a partner. Instead, you treated me like furniture. You thought you could throw me away and keep the house. You forgot that I owned the foundation. The board members looked at each other. They knew the damage was done. They had lost the competitive edge, but they still had a company to save. Arthur Sterling looked at me. He looked tired. He looked like a man who realized he had let a fox into the henhouse and was now begging the farmer to come back. Ms. Cruz, Sterling said, we cannot undo the past, but we have clients who depend on us today. If you walk away now, even with the license, we do not have the technical leadership to implement the transition. We are asking for your help. He paused. Will you stay on to manage the handover? We will pay whatever consulting rate you deem appropriate. I looked at the faces around the table. I looked at the terrified litigator. I looked at the defeated Gavin. And I thought about the team outside Marcus, the developers, the people who actually did the work. They didn't deserve to drown because their captain was a crook. 6 weeks, I said. Sterling nodded, relieved. 6 weeks. 6 weeks, I repeated. At the rate I established in our previous meeting, I will stabilize the system. I will train a new, competent lead engineer of my choosing. I will ensure Redstone is secure. And then, I am done. After that, you are on your own. You can choose to be a company of builders, or you can go back to being a playground for your relatives. That choice is yours. I stood up. I closed my laptop. The sound of the lid snapping shut echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. I picked up my portfolio. I did not look at the litigator. I did not look at Sterling. I turned my gaze to Gavin Pierce one last time. He was broken. He was a man who had everything and lost it because he thought he was too important to read the fine print. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel the need to laugh. I just felt the cold, hard satisfaction of balance being restored. You fired me because I called out nepotism, I said quietly. Gavin looked up, his eyes red. I left because I called out the truth, I continued. And the truth always has a price. I turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving the door wide open behind me. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where you are listening from and what you would have done in Camila's shoes. Please make sure to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.